So we come to the debate at the end of the day, and this is in a sense, it's the acid test. Where would we invest? Where for the electricity system of the future, what would investment look like? What would the choice between shale gas, nuclear, renewables, coal, CCS, large grids, small grids, storage, etc. So for this debate, our moderator is Stephen Vass, who's the Deputy Business Editor of the Sunday Herald, and he's going to introduce the speakers and moderate the discussion.
Okay.
So I'm going to hand over to you.
All right, thanks very much. And good to see you all. I'm sure the conference organisers are sort of only too happy that with today's event, the government has of course come out and made all these announcements about what the strike prices are going to be for renewables, and given an indication that they're prepared to offer guarantees at Hinkley Point for the nuclear power station, and also the British Geological Survey coming out talking about the fact that there's possibly twice as much shale gas, certainly in the north of England, than we thought there was already. So it makes today's discussion particularly topical. It probably breaks up a long period where it's felt kind of gloomy and not much happening, to say the least. Many people wondering, where are the government actually going to manage to announce the details of the strike prices in June as they planned to do. So I must admit, I didn't think they were going to do that myself until a few hours ago. So that's kind of heartening. It's a tough enough decision for where we go from here with electricity. If it wasn't for the fact that there are various running themes that certainly don't help. Obviously, the Fukushima disaster in Japan has made the world more wary of nuclear power. Obviously, opposition to onshore wind in the UK has gradually intensified. The economic crisis has made it harder to raise capital for relatively immature technologies, in which I'm sure you can include offshore wind. And it's also made leading economies more wary about making moves that are going to give their rivals a competitive advantage. And then on top of that, of course, you've got the coalition. Many of us, I think, were really starting to wonder whether the Lib Dems and the Tories could get close enough together with their energy policies to move this EMR forward at all. We're not there yet, but today's announcements at least take us well in the right direction. So, it doesn't have to be said. Obviously, it's a very contentious subject. What do we invest in for the next generation of electricity, and to what extent? I think you'll get a flavour of the disparity of views that can exist from the panellists that we have today. Next to me, we've got Professor Stuart Haszeldine, the Professor of Carbon Capture and Storage from Edinburgh University. He's a geologist by trade, I hope I'm right in saying, and he's one of the foremost experts in CCS, certainly in this country, and he sits on various government advisory groups. He co-leads the Scottish Carbon Capture and Storage Research Group, and he heads up the Centre for North Sea Enhanced Oil Recovery, and he also specialises in unconventional hydrocarbons, obviously including shale oil and gas. Next to him, we've got Professor Gordon Hughes, also of Edinburgh University. He's a part-time professor in economics, as well as wearing various other hats. He's recently become the chair of the Water Industry Commission for Scotland, and he's a commissioner on the Infrastructure Planning Commission. And he's become quite a prominent critic of renewable energy policy over the last few years, not least with a couple of papers that he produced last year with the Global Warming Policy Foundation, entitled "Why is Wind Power So Expensive and the Myth of Green Jobs?" So I'm sure that speaks for itself. And then at the end of the panel, we've got Karl, who is a green entrepreneur. He's the MD of Abundance Generation, which is pioneering online crowdfunding for renewable energy, I hope I'm right in saying. He started life as a parliamentary researcher in renewable energy before going on to set up a venture called Green Your Office, which helped small businesses source environmentally responsible products. And it was backed by the late Body Shop founder, Dame Anita Roddick. Anyway, so without blethering on any further, it's just the usual kind of procedure. Each of our panelists will give us a few minutes of presentation, and then we'll have a chat about what they've been saying. We'll open it up to questions, of course, so do be thinking about what you'd like to ask them as we go, and we'll just go left to right, if that's all right, and start with Professor Haszeldine.
Okay, thanks very much, Stephen. Tell me if I'm up at 5 minutes, obviously. So I'm going to start off by saying that I don't think we've got a problem with the supply of fossil fuel in the sense that it's going to run out. I think what we have is a supply problem that there's far too much fossil fuel. It doesn't really matter whether it's coal, oil, or various sorts of conventional, unconventional gas, or eventually hydrates. There's far too much carbon available. And it's clear from historical geological precedent as well as climate modelling, which are two completely independent techniques, that we're probably about halfway or slightly over halfway to the total amount of carbon we can put into the atmosphere as a carbon stock, and before frying the planet to beyond 3, 4 or 6 degrees, choose your target. And the amount of carbon we've got in the atmosphere already and in the ocean from geological analogues will cause a rise of sea level for between 5, 10 or even 15 metres, and that's what we're already committed to even if we stopped burning carbon tomorrow. So we have a carbon problem and that needs dealing with. I will also argue that some of the effects of the more extreme weather we're seeing are exactly along the lines of what you expect from carbon excess in the atmosphere. They're exactly the harbingers of climate change and unusual weird weather and harvest failure and food shortages and population movements and all those dire effects. And the official White House figure released to coincide with Obama's speech earlier on is that just one item on its own from Hurricane Sandy cost $65 billion US. Okay, so the price of renewable energy, in contrast to that single event, is extremely cheap. Okay, money is not the argument. Survivability of humans in the way we know and love the earth is the argument. And if money is what we're talking about, I'm not that fussed about the money. So the challenge is how to manage carbon, and we have to find a way of producing electricity and heat and motive power for moving items with unfeasibly low carbon footprints. And of course we can do this if we want to, because we've invented most of the stuff already. There's a few things outstanding, but we can do quite a lot of this with the tools we have to hand, which is just as well, because it usually takes about 10 to 30 years to develop new tools, so we better use what we've already got, because we've only got about 30 or 40 years to make a really serious inroad into this. So you're expecting me to talk about carbon capture and storage, so I'll talk about carbon capture and storage. And this is a way, obviously, as most people will know, of reducing the rate of emission from power stations or from centralized industries. We could have started carbon storage and this method in about early 1990s. The reason we haven't is that all governments worldwide have been too slow to incentivize it. Government's job is to incentivize and guide companies and tilt the market for the medium and long term, and all governments have failed to do this. With the exception of a couple of places, and you can see the immediate results in Norway, that the Sleipner project in Norway storing carbon beneath the North Sea came about as a direct result of a carbon tax on offshore emissions. So the oil company did the impossible within 2 years and managed to find a way of storing carbon in a reservoir underneath the sea. Saskatchewan and Alberta have put a carbon tax on their carbon, and immediately within a couple of years you can see large industrial projects looking at carbon capture and storage, etc., etc. So the cause and effect is extremely clear. The UK is doing a lot of talk, but hasn't really got round to doing the action. But of course the electricity market reform, pricing carbon selectively in power plants is exactly what's needed. So I'm hopeful that tax on carbon, that price for carbon, will drive investment into storing carbon and out of dumping it into the atmosphere. The problem with CCS, of course, it hasn't not yet really started. So there were supposed to be 12 demonstrator plants by now. 2 in the UK may start on construction in 2015, or they may not. There's plenty of opportunities for downward revisions until now and then, but we have to sometime have the courage to walk the walk. But of course, as some of you may know, then there is a carbon capture and storage plant being constructed now in Saskatchewan, Alberta, at the Boundary Dam lignite-fueled power plant that will capture its first CO2 in November, and the cost of that has come in below expectations, and the director of that project says he can do the next CCS project there at 30% less than the price he's paid just now. So again, learning by doing is a well-proven method, and that will happen, and CCS is capable of being very effective and very cheap. On the other topics, then shale gas, you can have as much shale gas as you want in the United States. That's given us the opportunity to have schizophrenia in the UK through having a low carbon policy whilst burning as much cheap coal as we can get away with. So that's not a sustainable position, really. Shale gas in the UK, geologically, I say that's interesting. There will be some, but I think the cultural barriers will be extreme to drilling, having drilling pads every 2 or 5 kilometres throughout even parts of Lancashire, Yorkshire, etc. will be quite difficult, even if you do pay the local community the odd £1,000 or so. They're worth more than that in the UK. The present default policy, of course, with our schizophrenic government is to have the Treasury fighting against the Department of Energy. So the default policy is to bring in lots of liquefied natural gas for the future. And so we're going to bring in these huge tankers of liquefied natural gas, of which anything goes wrong with that, either accidentally or by terrorism, is about the same amount of energy as one large nuclear bomb. So that's a very stupid thing to bring into the centre of London, I think, or into South Wales. If you're bothered about the risk of storing a little bit of carbon dioxide underneath your house, I think you should move out of all these areas for a 50-kilometre radius almost immediately. And then coal, we can carry on burning coal. It's far too cheap. There are numerous downsides to coal, and now's the time to get out of coal. Are you closing me down now? But if we do nothing about all these, which is what we're busy doing, we're doing very little, because the carbon intensity of electricity generation around the world, as measured by the International Energy Agency, the carbon intensity of how much CO2 per unit of electricity has not changed since the early 1990s. So all the renewables, all the environmental actions have produced zero practical result. The renewables build has satisfied the demand increase for electricity, but we're still emitting probably about 10 times too much carbon per year than the world can cope with. If we do nothing about that, and we're busy doing nothing, we need to reduce it about 2.5% of the emissions per year cumulatively. If we do nothing, then climate engineering is inevitable, and the consequences of climate engineering are difficult to predict. Most of them are potentially undesirable. There are some experiments you could do, and those might be very sensible to get on with, because that is the last resort position we're now headed into. By contrast, we've started a renewables revolution. The renewables technologies are immature. They need time to roll out. We're at the Model T Ford stage of doing this. We didn't stop building cars because the first one only did 10 miles to the gallon. We carried on and we got a lot better at building cars, and that will happen with renewables. And one of the big missing things there for me is storage of electricity on the terawatt scale for a week's worth of electricity, or a couple of weeks worth in electricity, not for a couple of hours worth. And eventually we will work out some smart nuclear power, which is breeder reactors. It's no point in wasting money on these burner reactors we're about to incentivize with 10 billion of my money. That's, in my view, a waste of time and effort. And lastly, I'd say that the market in the UK is a big problem. The market's great at delivering cheap electricity from existing power plant, but it's totally unable to invest in the spectrum of desirable technologies which we want to have us spreading the risk across all the technologies which we should have in the UK, because we cannot predict the future with any great certainty. So I'm in the business of spread betting. Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much. Okay, Professor Hughes.
I start from a very different perspective, and I start primarily from the perspective of having spent close on 10 years trying to negotiate environmental agreements and environmental legislation in a variety of parts of the world, and therefore having some sense of what is likely to be acceptable outside what I think is a bubble in the UK and in Europe about energy futures. The crucial thing for the kind of things that Stuart was talking about is China. Essentially, if you haven't got a good story for China, forget it, because the growth in the total emissions in China over the next few years will essentially outstrip the total level of emissions in the whole of the European Union very quickly and go on up from there. So essentially, you've got to have something that's economic and viable from a Chinese perspective, not from our perspective of what we would like China to do, but from what China wants China to do. And that gives you a very different view. Now, China faces a number of choices. Coal is actually not as abundant as many people think. They have started to need to import coal, and there is a significant probability that imports will increase substantially, which probably isn't something that they would want. There is a lot of shale gas in China, and my view is that it's an absolute certainty that they will exploit that. China is very short on conventional natural gas, but not at all short on unconventional natural gas, and they will exploit that, and they are not going to bother about concerns over fracking or the rights of people who want to object to having pipes next to their farms or the like. So essentially, there will be a large switch to gas over the medium to long term in China. They are also interested in, and they are likely to use, nuclear power if the nuclear power can stay within a reasonable range of essentially fairly clean technologies such as gas combined cycle plants. Now, I've done a series of calculations comparing what things might look like from a Chinese point of view in 2020, and what you find is that because gas prices are relatively high in Asia and are not necessarily going to come down a lot, you find that you need to be able to produce at around $90 to $95 megawatt hour to be competitive with gas as the primary option for new investment. Now, you can't quite get down to that for nuclear power, but you can probably get within 10% of that if you have a large enough stream of relatively standardized nuclear power plants of the fourth generation. And if you aren't so concerned about safety standards, you can get it down below that as well. So nuclear power is a real alternative. The other real alternative is obviously coal. I'll come back to coal because the real question is, can you combine that with CCS? Of the rest, renewables and a whole variety of other things, well, China says that it's promoting renewables. What it's actually doing is promoting hydropower, of which it's got lots and lots of resources available, and basically other forms of renewables are and are going to remain completely marginal. One of the reasons is that the climate isn't particularly favorable in large parts of China, and secondly, it's also the case that renewables are relatively land intensive, and land is not exactly the most abundant of resources in China. There's lots in the deserts of the Tarim Basin and the Gobi and so forth, but that's a very long way away from where you actually want the power. So that brings us back to coal as an alternative. And here there is a really large lesson that has to be learned from previous environmental developments and regimes. The crucial one, which I was heavily involved with, is the adoption of flue gas desulfurization on coal-fired power plants. Now, for a very long time, the Chinese resisted that. They only reached the point at which they were willing to install that kind of equipment is when the cost of doing so came down to being really small relative to the base cost of constructing a plant, basically less than 5%. If you don't have to increase the cost by more than 5%, then they were willing to do it and not otherwise. Now let's turn that to the issue of CCS. Because at that point, you then have to ask, how much do CCS prices have to come down in order to make it realistic that you can find either retrofitting of CCS to existing power plants or fitting it to new power plants? And the answer is an enormous amount, much more than the kind of levels that at least are out there in the literature generally. The key problem actually is the heat rate. The problem is that at the moment there is a significant penalty for using CCS on the amount of coal per megawatt hour that you have to burn. And you really have to bring that down. The current figures that I've seen quoted vary from 20 to 40%. Well, you've got to get that down below 10% to have a realistic chance of actually having CCS viable. You've also got to get the cost of constructing the whole CCS chain, in other words, the capital cost involved, down to something probably in the range of $400 or $500 per kilowatt of installed capacity. Again, far below what the current figures are. So basically speaking, the challenge is that if in the long run you want to persuade the Chinese to adopt a technology that will reduce carbon emissions, the challenge is that the cost of CCS has to come down to somewhere between 10 and 20% of where current estimates put it. Now, that may be possible. I'm not an expert in the technology. I'm not an expert in, I've seen an awful lot in terms of the way these curves have gone for other new technologies. And that's a very, very big reduction that has to be attained. But that in the end is what realistically will be required if there is to be a genuine form of dealing with the carbon emissions, not only from China, but actually the same would apply for India and a variety of other places. So let me leave it at that.
Okay, great. Okay, finally. Karl.
Thank you.
Karl Harden.
I feel I've slightly cheated. I've brought some slides along just to help me on this one, but I hope they're sort of bumped along a little bit. So really, before sort of starting looking forward, I thought it was just useful to maybe just have a quick look back at the last sort of big transition we went through in the UK in terms of our energy system, where we moved from gas to electricity. This was for street lighting and so forth. This wasn't a move that was made just because gas wasn't doing a particularly good job. In fact, we actually still use gas for lighting in certain parts of London still. But just because electricity was just a much better way of doing stuff. The transition took off sort of in 1879 when we had the first electric street light in Newcastle. But really, electrification didn't really drive forward until the 20s, 30s and 40s. But even then, there was huge battles being fought in the rural sort of shires against the pylons that are going through. As a renewable guy, it was quite interesting looking at that because it took time, but acceptance built and electrification rolled out. What I think is interesting sort of most about this change is that the transition required really a total rethink about the way things were done. It was a systemic change requiring new business models, new technologies to come together and grow over an extended period of time. So I believe that renewables offer the same transformative leap forward. As we've heard earlier, solar has massive potential, but we're in transition. But over the medium to long term, they offer cheap power. They're the most stable, resilient way of generating energy, less centralized and with reduced dependency on global energy markets and volatile sort of foreign regimes. And they're obviously clean. But building on the gas analogy, you need to understand them in the context of a transition and a systemic change. If you look at renewables through the prism of the 20th century energy markets, they don't really work. It's a bit like fitting a sort of square peg into a round hole. Our current energy system is being designed for centralized, high marginal cost producers where generators and consumers are separate entities. Renewables turn all this on their head. They operate via a totally different business model. The feedstock is free. where coal and gas, the major sensitivity is the fuel. With renewables, it's the cost of capital. When capital is paid off, their costs of operation are negligible. They open the possibility that people and companies become both consumers, generators, and owners of energy. This is a radical departure from the past and totally disruptive to the current way that the system is built and the energy markets are constructed. And solar, for instance, we only need to get to sort of retail, they only need to compete with retail prices if we're going to have a major breakthrough. And with energy prices going up and the costs of panels coming down, grid parity on domestic PV is probably only 2 or 5 years away. And with a major energy shock, potentially war in the Middle East or something else, that grid parity point can come forward. We heard earlier that in Germany, arguably, we're getting close to that at the moment. Renewables are obviously intermittent. This does create challenges, but if we think about this as a systemic change, we can start to deal with these. So to really harness the potential of generating cheap, clean, homegrown energy, we need to therefore redesign the grid, we need to redesign the energy markets so that we have an energy system fit to take advantage of this technology. So what needs to happen? Where do we need to invest? I think we've probably heard most of these points today, so I'll sort of run briefly through, but I think prioritization of renewables, helping the various technologies, spreading our risk, moving technologies down the cost curve, redesigning the energy markets. They work with low marginal cost producers, intermittent generation, and a variety of technologies at different points in their maturity. For instance, and we are seeing a lot of this coming through in the energy bill, but capacity payments and different sort of feed-in tariffs or contract for differences for different technologies. We need to obviously modernise the grid, keep moving it forward, make it more and more intelligent, better able to match supply, demand, facilitate the creation and development of the new models which help us monetize megawatts. Upgrade the grid so we can connect to the new source of generation and the interconnectors we need to connect to Scandinavia, Iceland and so forth, and obviously to continue to support, develop the commercialisation of energy storage. But we are in transition and we do need transitional fuels, and for me the obvious choice is gas along with carbon capture and storage. And yes, we should dig for shale gas. I quite look forward to the chance that communities to really be faced with the energy choice themselves. Do they want wind? Do they want gas in their back garden? I know what most people will probably end up choosing. But we need to obviously sort methane leakage, groundwater contamination, and the earthquake risk when we're rolling this out. So is this investment worthwhile? Is the prioritisation of renewables going to get us to a better place? I think this graph I find quite interesting. It's from Germany in 2008. It shows the power price on a summer's day, and you've got the orange line, which is peak energy, and then you've got the black line, which is base load price. And if you fast forward to 2012, once the big PV rollout had happened, you see that during the day when the PV starts kicking out energy, prices collapse. Peak energy price actually drops almost to the level of base load. And what countries are seeing is that the large rollout of renewables, the average cost of wholesale energy or wholesale electricity is actually dropping because the integration of renewables means that we use less of the peak energy generation. So this reduction in wholesale electricity prices, or the average price, is called the merit order effect. The Irish National Grid published a study, I think it was 15 months ago, that studied the merit order in Ireland, and they found that the merit order effect almost neutralised entirely the upfront subsidy cost. Their sort of finding was that if you include all the indirect and direct costs of building renewables into the grid, that merit order neutralised it. Obviously, still we have more work needs to be done to ensure that the system best works with this, and we can put in the storage and various elements to help make this benefit come right through to the consumer. But what it's also doing is it's eroding the profitability of the big utilities. Moody's put out a report in 2012 which put a credit warning on the utilities, or a forward warning, that the introduction of renewables was gradually eroding wholesale energy prices and eroding their profit margin. That's quite a good thing. It starts to sort of bring back the power into the hands of the decentralized energy network. And gives us a great opportunity for the next sort of 50 years we start to move forward. But we are in transition. This is not something we can do immediately. We do need to build all the bits of the puzzle so that we can take these benefits and actually roll them out. But it took, from the gas, the rollout of that, 70 to 90 years. We've only really been doing renewables properly for 20 years. We've got another 50, 60 years to go till we build the system that will give us the cheap, clean power that we all want. Thank you.
Okay, so I mean, maybe that's just the point that you were making just a second ago, Karl. Maybe that's one to open up a bit. This benefit of the cost of wholesale electricity dropping through the way that renewables affect the merit order of electricity supply. Do you agree with that, Professor Hughes?
No, it's complete rot. If you actually look at the data, it doesn't show that at all. What happens is something significantly more complex. During periods when intermittent supplies are available, there is a downward pressure on the wholesale market price in any country that has significant amounts of renewables. So you can see that in the UK, you can see it in Germany and Ireland and elsewhere. However, you have to bear in mind that the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine. And the crucial thing is, does the wind blow or the sun shine at the periods of peak demand? Because it's the peak demand periods which really set the highest prices and ultimately drive the average prices over a significant period of time. And for that to be the case, you've basically got to have, if you're on solar, you've basically got to have a summer peak time with a large air conditioning demand, which is not far from the situation in parts of the United States. But on the other hand, if you're relying on wind and you have a winter peak time demand, then you don't have that correlation at all. You have actually rather bad correlation between the availability of wind and when peak demand periods are. And so the consequence of that is that we find ourselves actually having the effect of something like renewables in the UK as being to push up the prices in the wholesale market. Now, the thing is a great deal more complex for another reason, which is you need balancing power. Balancing power in the short term, smoothing over the intermittency, comes in sense from the existing stock that we've invested in, but which we've written off. But if in the longer term you still need balancing power in the system, you finish up with a completely different set of investments. There was reference to the intended capacity market in the UK. Well, Ireland already has a capacity market, and all of the contracted power under the capacity market tends to be gas single-cycle turbines that run at significantly greater expense than an old CCGT. So the situation is essentially that on one scale, renewables can be integrated very easily into a system at a relatively small level. But once you get to a large amount, and I've done a detailed study of Ireland, and you get up to attempting 30 or 40% renewables in Ireland, and you have one hell of a problem. And it's very expensive to meet that kind of supply with the intermittency side. It's not a problem if what you want to do is to get simply to 10%. I mean, let's not worry about that. It's when you want to get significantly above 10% that the real costs and problems begin to kick in.
So what about a country sort of maybe more comparable in size with the UK, like Germany, that has a lot more renewable power than we do right now? How does that look? Does that stand up the same theory?
Germany has got Germany's major investment is in both wind power and in solar. both of them are generating enormous problems in the management of the grid. The wind power is operating on average in Germany nowadays at roughly 20% load factor. The solar isn't much better than that. And essentially, the problems are that you're getting enormous spikes in the prices. And what's happening is the German utilities are fundamentally smoothing it up by essentially massive imports or exports in one direction or another. So essentially, the situation is almost farcical. The Germans want to close down their own nuclear power plants in order to import more from French nuclear power plants. I mean, that's the essence of what German policy is at the moment. And when it doesn't import it from French nuclear power plants, it generates the electricity from brown coal or black coal-fired German coal plant. That is not a sensible environmental policy.
I'll give you the chance to come back on some of that, Karl.
Yeah, I'll just quickly really, because I suppose the first point, the Irish National Grid report very clearly talked about the full cost of renewable integration and the merit order more or less neutralising it. But I think the points you make are absolutely the points I made in my presentation, that we're in transition. We're building all the bits that we can manage this. We're 20 years in to a 70-year journey. We know how to manage renewables. We know how to scale it up. We know the systems we need to build around it. It's just about continuing and focusing on the journey.
Okay.
I heard all of the same stories 20 years ago when I was funding renewable energy projects from the World Bank. It's no better now than it was then. This is the problem. It's always something that is going to be solved 20 years or 30 years or 40 years in the future, not now.
Yes, indeed, yeah. Just state your name and your shoe size, if you would.
Michael Mackey, if that's anybody wants to do it. So, hold on. Yes, I'm very disturbed about my two gurus from Edinburgh University trailing out the 20-year-old conventional arguments about the renewable energy, and to say renewable energy is a marginal piece. That's absolute crap, sir, Mr. Professor Hughes. I know more about it, I suspect, than you. I have 3 megawatts of wind power driving my business. I know the cost of it. It's producing energy now at 6 pence, at full cost, at 6 pence per kilowatt produced. And that's only the beginning. Renewable energy, with all the inventions it's coming, and that's the colossal cusp of the revolution, the huge investments that's coming on storage, and the obvious is hydrogen and into ammonia and a great heap more. That's waiting for us, and the cost of renewable energy is going to come down more and more and more. The cost of conventional energy is doubling every 7 to 10 years, and that will go on up, and they're now crossing over. They are crossing over now. And it doesn't take your economics degree to work out where the world's going if renewable energy becomes the cheapest, and it is absolutely unlimited. Everything else is limited, and that's the revolution that the world is sitting looking at. So all these damn stupid conventional arguments that you're coming up with that I've heard ad nauseum for the last 20, 30 years, you've got to stop it and look at the huge revolution that's waiting for us, as Karl was trying to tell us. And I think he's got the huge message for us, that old-fashioned conventional, and the nuclear is the same. The nuclear's got a place if we need a transition. But in 20 to 30 years, all energy can come from renewables once we've cracked this storage. And I would love to see you gurus who are out there advising people coming up with that message instead of this old-fashioned conventional crap. I'm just being naughty because you used a naughty word yourself, Professor Hughes.
Does anyone else want to come in at this point? You and the chap with the glasses there, halfway back.
Thank you very much. It's not specifically addressing to the old gentleman over there, but anyway.
Sorry, could you just say who you are, please?
Sorry, I was saying it was not specifically directed to. Kingsley. Yeah. Oh, States. All right, but I'm going to Brussels soon. But anyway.
All right.
Yeah. So my question specifically is about the importance of China. I don't know if you guys noticed, but about a year ago, in I think December of 2012, there was a presentation in London about of a book, of a report called the China World Energy Outlook. It was published by a guy from NDRC. It was basically the publishing of an executive summary, English executive summary of a 600-page scenario report coming from the NDRC on the Chinese perspective on global energy. The thing is, like, I've been trying to acquire that book for a long time, to no luck. Maybe I have to physically go to China to get that book. To my understanding, there is no English translation to date, but I think I agree with you 100%. The Chinese perspective and their plans would mean a lot to us. I personally can read and write Chinese, but the thing is, like, not a lot of people would be able to understand what China wants if they are not translating that report into English, which is quite disappointing in some respect. But anyway, sorry, it's just a comment. Maybe the gentleman, professor, can maybe.
Oh, well, that's China.
Yeah, I'd like to respond to your comment about the China energy outlook, which was prepared by the Energy Research Institute at the NDRC. And this year they are preparing the English version. It will be a several hundred-page report. Then I'd like to give some comments about nuclear development. When we look at nuclear development after Fukushima Daiichi, in different parts of the world, countries have different policy. For instance, in Germany, the nuclear power will be phased out by 2022. If we go to China, because the national circumstance are totally different, because if Chinese government doesn't develop nuclear, the alternative won't be beautiful. It will be coal-fired power generation, from mining to transport to end use. The coal industry is very environmentally unsustainable. So whenever I discuss this issue with the think tank community in Washington, D.C., my viewpoint actually is a little bit strange, because for me, I support at least one country in the world, such as Germany, is trying really hard to see whether we can walk away from nuclear energy. The reason is pretty simple, because when we look at what's going on for the nuclear development, for the top 4 nuclear countries in the world, 3 of them have very serious nuclear accidents in the past. So that's why whenever I look at China's nuclear construction plan, I'm very concerned about the safety feature. Having said that, I'm also in support of the cautious development of the nuclear industry in China, because otherwise China will build too much coal-fired generation, which will be extremely difficult to be dealt with in the future.
Yeah. So it's a hard choice. You can't. It sounds like you would prefer to avoid nuclear altogether, but it's not as simple as that. It
only depends on the national circumstance.
Yeah. I was going to. I think you were wanting to say something. I was going to ask you something about CCS, but
so it's 2 related points, I suppose. So, I mean, I think China is undoubtedly a problem. I mean, this wasn't supposed to be just about China, I guess, but China is undoubtedly a central issue globally. But I'm encouraged by the fact that China is a very sensible country. It's making plans, and when it's ready, it will move on it. So that it's introduced pilot carbon markets in 4 or 5 provinces now. Those are being rolled out over the next 2 or 3 years to establish carbon trading in Chinese terms, adapted for China. And also, central government in China has sent out its edict that we want you guys in the provinces to get ready for carbon capture and storage. And that's never happened before. So this is a serious, at least, line-up at the starting blocks, I think. And so we've got a couple of people in China right now, because we'll be working on the project to help deliver a plan for carbon capture and storage in China during the next 6 months. And that, historically, when that happens, that often leads to pilot projects. China's already got 20 pilot projects on carbon capture and storage. And so historically, when this happens, that will lead to pilot projects becoming a reality, to scaling up, and probably real projects, if all that continues as you would hope, real projects within 5 years. So I think China is very well aware of its air quality problem. It's well aware that it stands to be a big climate loser, and when it's ready, it will move on that.
Okay. I was wondering what you thought about today's announcements. No signs of any new intervention for CCS in the UK. Were you surprised?
No, I'm not surprised by that, because CCS is on its track within Department of Energy and Climate Change. They have a bureaucracy timescale. They have lots of boxes to tick, and they're dutifully ticking their way through the boxes, and the boxes will all be ticked one way or another by April 2015. In the UK. Now, I think personally that's entirely unambitious, and it may deliver 1 or 2 large commercial scale tests, which the UK's got the objective of driving down prices with that, which is part of the criterion for rollout. But again, that is not on the pathway for developing that as an industry. If we were serious about decarbonising the UK in plus or minus shale gas by 2030, then that's not nearly enough. We need to have 5 projects working before 2020, and we need to follow that with another 15, and then we need to have all that decarbonised by 2030. Now, we can do all that if we want to, but we don't have the courage to have the leadership to make the investment in that. And it's for those reasons that I think the present UK government's holding back from committing to carbon budgets for 2030, because arithmetically, without some magic, whether that magic is CCS or whether that magic is something in addition to shale gas, even transferring wholesale from coal to gas, arithmetically you can't make your carbon budget. So we are heading into a very stuck place, and that's through lack of ambition and lack of follow-through, because again, we're hesitant to actually make decisions. My experience of lots of government, unfortunately, is it's much better to do nothing than to do something which may be the wrong thing. Whereas actually I would be much more adventurous and bet on 5, and maybe 4 will work and 1 will fail, but that's the price of revolution.
Do you get the sense that they have accepted that, you know, the Canadians and the Americans are so far ahead now that it's not worth prioritising anymore?
No, I don't think it's a priority within Department of Energy, but it's a priority as a very interesting large-scale experiment which should hopefully pay off in the 2020s, which is not what I think we need to do with the urgency of the carbon budget, because all this discussion is all about how do we manage this to provide cheap electricity for our citizens during the next 5 or 10 years. Whereas actually I'm trying to talk about a different time scale of 30 years, 50 years, 100 or 150 years. And Maitland Mackey is quite correct that I think we're in the renewables revolution. It can prove itself in selected places, and it will gradually expand from here onwards. And carbon capture and storage is a bridge. It's a bridge to somewhere. We haven't started constructing the bridge, and the somewhere is the pillars on the other side of the estuary or the river that we can construct with renewables, and maybe with whole new generations of nuclear plant and we've started the renewables bit, we haven't started the rest. But if we carry on in this way, then we won't actually have the opportunity, because as the climate continues to change faster and faster, then we'll be more and more diverted into managing the consequences of that change.
Okay.
Can I pick up the question of storage? Because in a sense, I would entirely concur with you about the importance of storage to practically any variant of what future you may look for. But we should also bear in mind that we've got a wonderful way of storing electricity already. It's known as hydropower. And there are many, many countries in the world which could or can already do make use of hydropower in ways that would be much more effective than currently is the case. The problem is that there are always large and difficult choices that have to be made. There was effectively a period of more or less 20 years when hydropower was basically the sign of the devil. It was involved typically large dams. Large dams meant displacing people, and typically the people who were displaced were very unhappy about it, and there were large numbers of groups who therefore objected to it. I think part of all of the issues that we have to recognize and talk about is that it's very easy to talk about transitions to an unknown future. It's very easy to talk about how the technology is going to be different in future. Personally, my interpretation of history is different from Karl's, because I'm always struck by how slowly things change, not by how rapidly they change. And my personal bet is that we will still be entirely dependent, or very largely dependent, on fossil fuel in 2050. Now, the thing is that if we don't want to be, it involves spending a serious amount of money and upsetting a serious number of people. And actually, a very large amount of the problems are essentially who are you going to upset, or who is going to pay for that transition. And we have no agreement on that, and we have no clear way forward by which we'd even get towards an agreement of it. So a large part of the problem is that selling visions is one thing, but I'm a practitioner. I actually have spent a large amount of time having to do things politically, and that's far more difficult than just simply offering a large vision of what the future is going to be. And essentially, we can do what we like, provided that you, or whoever it may be, persuade the public at large, the population of China or the UK or Europe, to pay for it. To pay for it sufficiently generously that essentially that investment that is required can actually be found and can be put into the uses that are available. But I sense, and I stick by this, that there is not that willingness to pay for it.
But is there going to be the I mean, by making that argument, presumably you're taking a reasonably benign view of what's going to happen with fossil fuel prices. Because if you thought they were going to be rising, then you know we'd be talking about, is there going to be the will to pay for that? I mean, you know, the Climate Change Committee think that it'll be cheaper to transition towards renewables by 2030, don't they?
That has always been the real argument, which is that if we don't do this, fossil fuel prices are going to go through the roof. The only people who believe that is the Climate Change Committee. The history, just a moment, the history of fossil fuel prices is one of extreme cyclicality. And you have to believe that that cyclicality is being abolished if you are to believe that the prices are going to go on in the way that they have done. Now, I don't. I'm a statistician by background as well as an energy economist. And I don't believe that story because it isn't what history tells me. What history tells me is every time the prices get and stay high, we come up with new technological revolutions. That is what shale gas is.
Let's. You're saying what? In 5 years it'll be over $100 a barrel? $100 a barrel now. Okay, but that's where it is already, though, pretty much.
So it's a safe bet. That's good.
Okay, yeah. And so you don't think it's necessarily going up then? Sorry, can I just bring in one or two other people?
$100 a barrel, the story doesn't make sense. The story for the Climate Change Committee kind of story is that it has to go above $200 a barrel.
Let's get some views in from the back there. There's various people waving their hands. How about you with the bluish shirt in the middle, and then we'll come to you. Yeah, please, yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, Tim Foxton from University of Leeds. I wonder, maybe we try and bring this back to sort of how we manage this low carbon transition if we accept the need for it. You know, we've sort of realizing in the UK that markets on their own are not going to be enough to stimulate the high levels of investment in the low carbon technologies that we need. So we've got electricity market reform, but governments, as we know, are not very good at picking between technologies. And then we have this sort of very enticing vision of the more distributed future where communities and civil society play a much bigger role. So, how do we manage this? What are the appropriate roles of government and markets and civil society in actually managing this low carbon transition?
Okay. Now, and the chap with the, is it a lilac shirt? Can't quite tell from this distance. Yeah.
Sorry, so yes, I don't think this is a matter at all of trying to convince the big energy companies to stop mining coal and shift towards renewables, and I don't think that's going to be the thing that leads the shift of the transition at all. I mean, there's a huge amount of conflict between the public and the big energy companies at the moment. You just have to look in any day's newspaper to see that. And I think community-owned energy has a huge part to play in bringing more renewables on board. So, I think widespread community public ownership of generation will make people use energy more efficiently. It'll make people start to think about whether they need to use as much energy as they do at the moment. And it will, I think, engage people a lot more with the energy issues that we've got. So I think to me as well, public ownership of energy paints a much brighter future than one in which we're fracking and mountaintop removal coal mining all the time. I think if we can shift towards a lot of what Germany, for example, is doing at the moment, whereby where there's, I think 10% of electricity generated last year in Germany was from community-owned projects. I think that'll be very, very positive. So what I really want to know is how we get to a place in which we have a lot more community ownership of generation, and why we don't have more community ownership right now.
It's a fair question. Do you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, I'll come in on that one. That's obviously an area I'm passionate about. I think what we've had over the sort of the previous 100 years is this centralisation of energy. People disengaged from it, removed from it, not really understanding what goes on. They flick their switch and something happens, magic. What renewable energy and the decentralised sort of agenda has to offer is reconnecting people with their generation, and that has many benefits, which is educational and maybe introducing ideas about how to use it more importantly. But I think the fundamental piece for me is the costs currently of this transition are shared by everybody in the UK globally. The financial costs, we feel it in our bills, but the profits are not. And that's where community ownership really has a big role to play. A lot of the profits from the rollout of renewables in the UK, as Mr. Mackey pointed out earlier, are sucked out overseas. They go into through either private equity fund-based entities out in the Cayman Islands, or they go into big utilities, sort of tax dodge schemes. What we're about is trying to get that benefit into the local community that is housing the generation. And I think that's the breakthrough, starting to share the profits with the people, with society, rather than just the costs. And then we can all share the future benefits of having a clean energy system.
Which I suppose George Osborne agrees about in relation to the comments today about shale gas and community benefits there.
I think we could.
I'm not sure if that's quite what people yeah, exactly. When's it a bribe? When's it? Sorry, there's various people wanting to come in. Try to not speak for too long because we're getting towards the end of time. Just, if you don't mind.
Yeah. Hello, I'm Mark Winskill. I'm from UK Energy Research Centre and University of Edinburgh. And I've been sort of working on this for a few years now in terms of thinking through alternative versions of the future and scenarios, and I'm a bit more confused than I used to be, because I think we kind of thought we knew what the answers were about 5 or 6 years ago. But and I think the world's proven to be a much more sort of difficult place, certainly in the UK. But what I thought when I was listening to the three speakers was actually there's a surprising amount in common, actually. And I'm sort of given up looking for silver bullets because I think, you know, would have found them by now if they were there. So what I do agree with Karl about is that this is a long-term project. This transition is a longer-term project than policy really wants to believe. So the problem is that policymakers and possibly the climate, the whole kind of the way the planet works is in a bit of a hurry. So it was very noticeable to me that everything went, you know, the word urgency became used a heck of a lot more around about sort of towards the end of the 2000s, and it's never really gone away. In the meantime, the conditions for doing urgency have become a lot more difficult. So personally, that makes me think that the future will, over the short term, I think this long-term transition is entirely credible, and I do believe those lessons from history are pretty robust. But in the short term, we have a real problem about tractability, and to me that means that the future in the short to medium term will look much more incremental than it actually the radical vision would propose. And you know, I think that is an important message to get across to policymakers, because the problem is when they try and do innovation, they think it's a short-term project, and it isn't. Innovation is overestimated in the short term and underestimated in the medium long term, and that medium long term thing is what gets forgotten about in policy. So when things don't work out, so I think it's important in this kind of meeting to try and build that into, this is the message of policy that we all agree on and we all sign up to.
It's a long-term thing, yeah. You can't expect it to happen overnight, yeah, quite agree. Got someone back there, but let's have this chat.
My question is, where...
If you could say who you are, please.
Where is this community-led...
Sorry, who are you?
Going to... Sorry?
Just say who you are.
Michael Jefferson. Where is this community-led energy going to come from? Fine if you've got lots of sun overhead. Fine if you're in Scotland, where lots of wind, lots of hydro, and indeed, as David Mackay has pointed out, the potential for storage through the various locks and so on that exist. But for most of the world, and for most of England, for instance, this situation doesn't apply. What leverage will local communities have on energy supplies? So I have a big question mark as to where the hell we're going. Because it seems to me, as Stephen mentioned this morning, as an old man doesn't want to know where the future is if we were actually really up against it, do we not have to think about involuntary simplicity? Not what we've just had over the last 5 years as a result of financial crisis, but long-term adjustment of lifestyles, of expectations, of material chases, of grand transportation lines and so on and so forth. We're going to have to cut back, not just for the people who never have had, not just the rich who can cut back marginally.
Yeah, but everybody.
But every one of us.
Yeah, you'll have been delighted today with the news about the Green Deal so far, I'm sure. Chap at the back.
Yes, my name is Ruud Wijmars, Delft University of Technology. It's an exciting conference to be at because there are so many different viewpoints, of course, in this complex energy system which we are trying to master. I just want to make one comment, and then I also have a question.
Keep it brief if you don't mind.
Yes, the comment is a piece of information. I think we need to be more optimistic than we are in this conference so far. And if you look at the Chinese situation, they are, of course, a threat in the sense that they pollute, but they are also an innovation motor. And I say that because, one, they are by now the largest scientific publishers, which is reflecting the amount of money they put into R&D. So if you take all the peer-reviewed journals in the world at the moment, then Chinese science, peer-reviewed, that is of high quality, is now outpacing American contributions. The Chinese national oil company has the largest R&D budget at the moment. It has overtaken 2 years ago Exxon. So that's another point. Yeah, you wanted to be brief, yeah. But I think it's important to keep proportion in the discussion. I go over to the question then, and that is to the carbon capture storage, because coal, of course, is going to be a mainstay, although we want more renewables. And Professor Haszeldine pointed out that we have now these pilots in China. To my knowledge, pilots have been only few and far between, in time-wise, in the West. Can you say a little bit more, because that has to save us, I guess, from being suffocated in carbon, about the scaling up of the pilots as you deem it feasible, as you're so involved with these projects in China?
Okay, if you don't mind, can you have a chat with the professor afterwards, just so we can get in a couple more comments, and he can tell you what he thinks himself. Look, can you get this chap down at the front who's been waving at me for ages?
Shale Gas of Uppsala University. We're calling this a Global Energy System Conference, and we're talking about electricity in UK, Europe maybe, but we have 20% of the global population that don't have an electricity yet. And we must start to think about how should they come into the picture. Renewables, of course. Well, China, we should remember that China is not consuming as much electricity as we other guys are doing here per person. There happen to be a huge amount of people living in China, 23% of the global population, and of course there will be big numbers, and we should not forget that also. So I think what was mentioned, we had to change. We had to change our habits, and that doesn't mean that the world will be worse, but it means that other people in the world have the possibility to climb higher and have a better standard. But I think we had to rethink.
Okay. Chap up at the back there.
Hi, it's Eric McCrory from SEPA. I will be brief. Is ERM going to be the solution in the UK, and globally, can regulation make everything better?
Good question. Good question. Anybody else? I think I can imagine what the yeah.
I had a quick question. I think it was probably addressed both to Professor Hughes and also to Mr. Harder. It seems to me that Professor Hughes is arguing that it's very difficult to solve some of these problems of renewables penetration from the top level, from the governmental or industrial level. But it also seems to me that Mr. Harder is arguing that actually from, and indeed Mr. Mr. Mackey has been arguing that from the grassroots level, a lot of these decisions now for consumers like myself make economic sense given the price of electricity for consumers. And I wonder if maybe we could have a brief comment from each of them on that point.
That sounds like as good a way to end as any. Can we just have sort of 15 seconds, 20 seconds from each of you just in relation to that?
Maybe just coming quickly on that. I think at that consumer level, it makes sense, and under the current regime, we've worked with companies who want to put generation onto their site because it enables them to manage their energy use better. And again, at the domestic level, there's multiple reasons. Even I think on electricity prices without a feed-in tariff, for somebody who's in their home for 30 years, it makes sense to buy a PV system now without a subsidy, so that could operate. And just that sense of resilience that it gives you is a huge driver. So yes, I think at the local level, there is a lot of change that can occur without government having to get involved.
I'm not sure you'd expect me to agree. Grid systems exist for a reason. They exist because there are large economies of scale in many technologies for electricity generation. There are very large economies of scale which come from having grids, and there are what economists call economies of scope from essentially sharing the deviations in load that lots of people have. The kind of story that Karl is telling assumes that you retain a grid. It assumes that you have the backup there. Fine. If that's what you want to do, pay for it, because it will be expensive. A grid system that provides that kind of smoothing, but isn't used, as it were, in large scale to get the rest of the economies of scale, just turns out to be very expensive. And we are hiding that from most people who take advantage of renewables on a small scale today.
And lastly then, okay, I think the UK is very bad at foreseeing the future, so it didn't see the North Sea oil boom coming. It manifestly didn't see the shale gas boom coming, and it probably is not going to see revolution in the Middle East coming as the United States becomes more inward facing and energy secure. The United States probably isn't very bothered about the Middle East, whereas most of our hydrocarbon, whether it's gas or oil, still comes from there. Investing in renewables is going to be reliable, and reliability is what we all want.
Okay, all very interesting. Not much point in summing up, but just to say thanks very much for listening. It's great that everybody's wanted to participate. You know, lots of different views, 100 different sort of strands all going in different directions that all ultimately obviously come back together to try and solve this crazy problem that we're faced with. So thanks very much to the three chaps on the panel, Karl Harder, Gordon Hughes and Stuart Haszeldine, and thanks to you all as well. You've been terrific.